Dr. Tim King is an ecologist based in Oxford who's been studying the importance of yellow meadow ant-hills in grasslands for over 50 years. In 2017, he described his work in Richmond Park in the Brad Ashby lecture, and he's accumulated much more information since then. So I'm going to hand you over now to Dr. Tim King for yellow meadow ant-hills, engineers, farmers, and conservationists. So Tim, you should be able to share your screen now. Yep, looks fine. And if you just want to go onto your slideshow view, we won't be able to do live transcription, I'm afraid. I think when it goes onto YouTube channel, there is a possibility of getting live transcription then. So we can offer that, but I'm afraid we can't do live. Okay,
Are you happy with what you can see now?
Yeah, yes. That's perfect, Tim. Okay, over to you.
Fine. Well, thank you very much to you all for turning in for this lecture from an ant freak. And I'd like to acknowledge from the very start the mission invertebrate, the Royal Parks, who started me on this look at the London Royal Parks from the ant point of view. And I'm going to concentrate on London, but I shall include some information from other sites as well. And you can see the size of some of these anthills in Richmond Park with Alistair Hayes demonstrating them on the right, and also the importance of the ants, which is indicated by the size of the ant you can see on the left-hand side. And I'll introduce them at first and then deal with their roles as engineers, farmers, and conservationists. So just to introduce them, this is the main mound-building ant in European grasslands, and they build the anthills probably because warm anthills increase the rate at which their young broods develop. The worker ants are only 3 and 4 millimeters long, yellow and underground, so you don't see them above ground very much, but there are up to 100,000 in a large mound, and they carry the soil surface particles onto the top at night after rain, and so you're not likely to see them building very often. They hibernate in winter, so at the moment, although despite climate change, they are probably still subterranean in groups with their groups of aphids. Now, these ants aren't pests. This is something I find difficult to get over to people. When people ask me at lectures, they've got ants coming into their kitchen, how do I get rid of them? I say that if you introduce a wider range of foodstuffs, you can introduce more species into your kitchen. Their mounds benefit a whole range of other species and should be preserved and encouraged in gardens, graveyards, and roadside verges, and included in management plans. If you have a management plan which doesn't have these anthills indicated as a distinct habitat, then you ought to add something to it to explain how you're going to preserve these anthills. They are engineers, farmers, and conservationists. And basically, your ignorance about ants is the result of the long-term neglect of the soil by biologists, something which Kieran Derek Brown will agree with, probably. The soil is very important to all the organisms which live above it, and there are far more species in the soil than the more charismatic species living above the ground. And you can see that nicely indicated in this diagram, where you can see the small number of above ground species. So I'm talking about species richness here, not diversity, which is quite different. And you can see below the soil the large number of boxes which indicate the large number of different species which are apparent below ground, which is obvious if you ever take a DNA sample for something like fungi or nematodes or anything like that. And so if you have the opportunity and you're wondering what to study, soil is a black box and not much is known about it, and yet it's terribly important for the interaction with the organisms above the soil. Why is this particular species of ant special and distinctive? Well, it has such an effect on the flora and fauna in the grassland. And it also affects the grassland between the anthills. It's not just the anthills themselves, but also the grassland between, as I explain, which is strongly affected by the ants. So they dominate the whole surface. It's a keystone species. There are lots of definitions for keystone species, but the obvious ones are in terms of numbers of individuals, and also what would happen if you remove the ants and their populations from the grassland, because this will reduce the number of different species which the grassland supports. They are keystone species. The mounds are very long-lived and they contribute to grassland heterogeneity. Straightforward grassland without anthills is boring, but with the anthills on the surface, you get almost 2 microhabitats in one. So where do these anthills occur? They occur in all sorts of habitats throughout Northern Europe, all sorts of grasslands, which are long-term grasslands, salt marshes, sea cliffs, mountain grasslands, old parklands, marshes, roadside verges and churchyards. They're abundant in British pastures. You don't see them very often now, perhaps, because there was a massive great eradication campaign between 1780 and 1813, when people realized just how much they reduced the productivity of sheep pastures. And so not only were their numbers reduced by ploughing in the Napoleonic Wars and during agricultural depressions like in the 1870s, but also the First and Second World Wars, dig for victory, even on Richmond Park, for example. And rabbit myxomatosis resulted in the shading and disappearance of a lot of anthills. And they're more or less invisible, even to many biologists. When we started on Richmond Park, most people hadn't realized, even those frequent in the parks, just how many anthills there were. They have the largest biomass for an ant species worldwide, up to 165 kilograms per hectare dry weight. A dense population can haul up to 7 tons per hectare of mineral soil onto the surface each year, and their mounds may last for hundreds of years. So this makes them quite different from the majority of British ant species. Only about 55, 60 ant species in Britain, several of those imported and rare in greenhouses. But this is the most important because it has so much an obvious effect on the distribution pattern of plants as well as animals. So here's the ant life cycle. This is the head of Lacus flavus, and you can see how small the eyes are, typical for a subterranean ant. Its antennae, of course, is how the various workers communicate with one another through a series of smells, because that's how ants communicate. The workers in the middle here, the winged drone is at the top and the winged queen beneath, and you can see how much bigger the queens are. But a worker colony, an anthill, may produce up to 400 or 500 drones a year and up to 200 queens. So you can see its investment in energy is considerable to raise such a brood. And you can look at these ants and work out their habits by marking them in lab colonies and videoing their habits over 24 hours. These are the ant larvae, which appear from the eggs, and then they're raised in late summer, early next spring, into pupae, the familiar ant eggs, which then hatch out into ant workers, queens and drones. And that's a series of workers with drones, winged drones, ready to emerge on their nuptial flight, which is in late August, beginning of September. And this is a typical queen after it's been fertilized. These queens can be distributed over something like 5 kilometers radius. They're fertilized in the air. And so if there are anthills nearby you in London, they're quite likely to reach local gardens and graveyards and so on from the sites in which they're most abundant. And she pulls off her wings, burrows down in the soil, 5 or 6 centimeters, and there either late in the autumn or early next spring starts laying eggs on the basis of energy which is deposited in her flight muscles, and starts rearing her first brood of workers, which then create a mound which gets bigger and bigger. So that's the queen with some of the workers she produces, showing their relative sizes. And that's a typical early anthill, when the workers start raising the soil above the surface in the first year or two. They're that size. And of course, they go below ground considerably. These are the sorts of channels and chambers excavated by the ants below the ground, in which they raise their brood each summer. So they have distinct vegetation. They have more species capable of growing through heap soil, more short-lived species like annual plants, the main place where short-lived winter annual plants occur in a grassland, more mosses which colonize bare soil like the Bryum species, fewer rosette herbs and creeping mosses on the north side. So they are really sand dunes in the grassland, and they create bare soil. They're the main source of bare soil suitable for oviposition of grasshoppers and other insects, solitary wasps, and so on in the grassland. And they produce higher temperatures and reduce soil organic matter. So you can see here that they do create a distinct habitat. This is an anthill from above, and you can see the sedge or something which is surrounding it, and the short-lived annual plant on top, and the bare soil as well. So that's just a typical anthill, which, and in a dense population, they take up to a quarter of the soil surface. So it's amazing to me that they're not included in more management plans, and their conservation is not regarded with more importance. That's another picture from Richmond Park showing mouse ear hawkweed, Pilosella officinarum on the surface. That's typical, and the short-lived mosses and the plenty of bare soil. So they can maintain these short-lived species even when the grasslands around them has been allowed to grow, if you like, too tall by lack of deer grazing or something like that. And sometimes they harbour large populations. This is from chalkgrass, and this is rock rose, typically very abundant like thyme on the surface of a large anthill. And you get a site like this. This is my site at Aston Rowett National Nature Reserve in the Chilterns, and this is what, if you like, a conservationist should aim for. Typical grassland used to cover counties and counties of Britain up to 1780, sheep grazing land. And you can see here the difference between an occupied anthill on the left and an abandoned one on the right, because anthills don't continue to be occupied for a long time. The longest the queen has been kept in captivity is 22 to 25 years. And ultimately the queens die, and then the colony may die. But of course, the bare soil on top may be colonized by another queen or another set of queens, which establish a new territory. Ultimately, though, many of the anthills don't survive to be recolonized and are colonized by a successional group of vegetation which happens. And they look quite different, and they decrease in volume, as these data from Aston Rowett show. I looked at the same anthills in 2007 and 2017. When they were occupied, they increased in volume by about 30%. But when they were abandoned, they decreased in volume by, say, 25%. So you get, that's part of anthill heterogeneity. Not all anthills are the same. In a population, they're all of different ages. Some are occupied, some are abandoned. And this creates a whole range of microhabitats which wouldn't otherwise exist. So that's a nice site which shows the heterogeneity of anthills. This is at Blake's Firs in the Porton Ranges, the biggest anthill site in Britain, 3 million anthills there. And you can see the difference between the north and south sides of the anthills. North sides are shaded and never get any sunlight. And you get north, south, east and west facing slopes quite apart from the heterogeneity created by bare soil. So they are engineered. How long lived are yellow meadow ant mounds and how fast do they grow? Well, this is rather a complicated graph, which I don't really want you to go into, but if you just, the size of the anthills increases from left to right across the graph, and just look at the 4 right-hand set of graphs. These are the same anthills in 1970, shown in blue, and in 2015, shown in green. And you can see that about 1% of them were over 40 litres in 1970, but in 2015, the same anthills had about 40%, which were over 40 litres. And so they last for a long time and they tend to increase in volume given the same sort of continuous management. And here is a site which was looked at by the famous John Pontin of Surrey. Many of you will know him, on the left-hand side for his doctorate at White & Woods in the mid-1950s. And this, I re-identified this site 62 years later and managed to map the same anthills. And on the left is John Pontin's map, and on the right-hand side is my map of the same site. And in fact, 21 of the 29 anthills he identified were still in place 62 years later. And this is one of the biggest anthill sites at Bushy Park. And there the grassland I dated to 1498 on the medieval Middlesex grassland. And you can see the large anthills on a Google photograph very clearly indeed. They take up about 25% of the total area of the grassland. And here's Stainsmoor, photograph from Robert Carter, which is claimed on their website as being even older, although I haven't been into its history. Large anthills, again, investigated by John Pontin. And this is Barnes Common. I'm afraid I haven't got any photograph of Barnes Common anthills, but it has got lots of excellent anthills, and I hope they've incorporated them in their proper management plans in the grassland. So here's a site of Richmond Park in 1944, taken by the US Air Force, and you can see the extent to which the Richmond Park was devastated by crops and airfields in the Second World War. There, the Richmond Gate is at the bottom and the Roehampton Gate is at the top left. And you can see the Queen's Ride going up the middle to the palace. And you can see just how much of that Richmond Park was devastated. And so the fields at Richmond Park are all of different ages. Some date from 1638 when the park was established, but many are much younger, but they still have anthills. And we started looking at the size of anthills on sites of different ages, helped by mission invertebrate. So this shows some of the mission invertebrate citizen scientists helping me, and each of those flags shows the position of one of the anthills we sampled in this particular site. So you can see how abundant they are, and most people walking through Richmond Park don't even know they're there, or think they're molehills or something like that. And it also is fascinating to youngsters to look at their surfaces because they have such a wide range of organisms easily available, quite apart from the ants. And when Alice Lawton put the data we collected on the first 6 sites in order, we were staggered. The oldest site is on the left-hand side and the youngest side is on the right-hand side. And we weren't really expecting this, but when she plotted the data, you can see that the oldest sites have the biggest average size of anthills, and the youngest size have the smallest size of anthills. At that stage, this was new data. We hadn't suspected it would be nearly so clear cut. So then I went round a whole series of extra sites at Richmond Park, which I could age precisely. Richmond Park's got a very well documented history, Bushy Park and several other sites in Britain, and did the same sort of thing and found they all more or less fell on the same line. Remarkably good for a biological scheme. The age of the anthills here, the grassland, is shown from left to right, increasing until grassland gets to 600 years old on the right-hand side. And the anthill index shows the size of the whole anthill populations. You can't age any individual anthill, but when you take them on a whole site, you can average their sizes. And you can see that Richmond Park, Bushy Park and Whighton Woods fall on the same line. And I've done 2 other sites since then and got an overall graph like this, which more or less shows that the anthills increase in volume very fast at first, and then their rate of increase slows down, as you'd expect, as the rate of erosion is important and their channels created by the ants inside collapse. Then but there is a very clear-cut relationship, remarkably good. In fact, you may, to some extent, be able to age grasslands from the size of their anthills. So I imagine I want to go to Staines Moor and just, if the grassland there is really 1,000 years old, as is suggested on the website, they should have a grassland anthill size more or less like Bushy Park. And you can deduce all sorts of other things from anthills. This is from Richmond Park, and you see those anthills are in a line. This indicates where there was formerly a fence, and the anthills were built up against the fence. And if you see an anthill of this shape, then it indicates that in the past, the vegetation was allowed to grow really tall. The ants build 3 times faster when they're shaded than when they're not. And this creates an anthill which is taller than it is wide, and then grazing resumed and the ant colony could survive. So you can deduce an awful lot from anthill sizes and shapes. So how many anthills do you think there are on the 4 square miles of Richmond Park? Well, I've already given you the answer in the blurb to this talk. It's about 400,000. You must bear in mind there are lots of sites in Richmond Park which are mown rather than grazed, and mowing destroys the anthills in the long term. And also an awful lot of area like the Isabella plantation which are forested and don't have these sorts of anthills on, but 400,000 is a fair estimate from the 11 sites I've sampled and multiplying up by what I know of the site. 400,000. And are there approximately 100, 500, 1 billion, 3 billion ants in Richmond Park? Well, I come down to 3 billion workers, because if you take the average size of an anthill, occupied anthill, as 15,000 workers, and some people have found up to 100,000 in an anthill. If you say 15,000 on average, and imagine that half the anthills at Richmond Park are occupied, then you come down to 7,500 per anthill. And if you multiply that up by the 400,000, you get to 3 billion. So incredibly abundant, but not as heavy in winter as deer. Probably a quarter, a fifth of the weight of deer. So these ants farm underground aphids, just as humans farm sheep and cattle. There are 22 specialized species of aphids which live on the roots of the plants nearby in groups, particularly on the grasses. And the ants collect them in winter and replace them in spring on the roots of the grasses. A high proportion are single clones. So I sampled the soils to find out what was there. That was my sampling device, and I had groups of 6 with anthills at either end, close to the anthills next, and 2 grassland ones in the middle. And you can see the groups of cores I took out, which were nearly 15 centimeters long. You can see the channels excavated by the ants in the left-hand one. And I looked at a large number of these. I looked at them in Tolgren funnels, getting the organisms out. You put the soil samples underneath the bulb, which provides heat and light, and the small organisms less than 2 millimeters across don't like the heat and light and migrate downwards. They fall through the gauze into a very pleasant death in alcohol. And that's the sort of setup you use over, say, 5 days. And then you've got a sample of the small organisms which you can identify. So my results from 3 sites, each taken 3 times, 4 anthills a time, so 216 samples, whereas each square metre of anthill contained nearly 70,000 worker ants. Each square metre of soil between the anthills contained about 5,500 worker ants. So the ants were remarkably abundant between the anthills. In fact, about a quarter of the ants at any one time during the day were between the anthills, not in the mounds themselves. Each square metre of anthill soil contained 844 aphids, but most of the aphids, 94%, were between the anthills in the grassland. The aphids were clumped, and there were also lots of mites and springtails there as well. That's the sort of aphids you see. And that's an ant which clung onto an aphid as it got through the Tolgren funnel. They've got a tremendous affinity for aphids. I couldn't detach this aphid from the ant, and that happened 3 times as well. It was almost taking the aphid with it. And these ants have got an ideal method of getting energy, which they then feed direct to their larvae. So they tickle the back end of the aphid produces honeydew, and then the ants slurp it up and take it to their ant larvae in the anthills. And this means they bypass most of the primary production in the grasses, which is involved in producing cells and grass leaves and that sort of thing. They're just taking the sugar from the plants directly into their ant larvae. And in fact, they may well, in many cases, have an energy intake by this means which competes with that of the deer or sheep growing above the soil. And that's why the old-fashioned pastorists wanted to get rid of them, because they were reducing the productivity of the grassland so much for the sheep they were trying to raise above it. So those are typical springtails, and massive numbers of different species of mites, about 50 different species of mite. So the anthills are relatively sterile breeding centres. The workers affect the surrounding grasslands by building tunnels to their aphid cattle. The aphids reduce plant growth, so the anthills above ground are just the tip of the iceberg. The ants affect and depend on the whole of the seething soils nearby, and the plants too. So these ants are conservationists. They increase the range of animals and plant species on a site. They increase species richness of flora and fauna, apart from creating bare soil, transporting soil from the depth to the surface, creation and aeration and drainage channels, which in acid grassland, Kieran, must be probably just as important, if not more so, as earthworms. They're refuge for low-growing characteristic grassland plant species when the surrounding grassland is undergrazed, and they recycle nutrients. They're tremendously useful for other organisms. They're a food source for the green woodpecker. Grasshoppers are 16 to 30 times more likely to oviposit on anthills than in the surrounding grassland. Some butterflies and moths, and there are numerous species associated with them which depend on the anthills. And of course, it gets very warm, up to 50 degrees Celsius on the south side of an anthill in summer. And they provide early spring grazing for sheep, deer and cattle. So this is an example of a parasite which specializes in anthills. This Antennophorus, these are about 250 of an inch across, but they wrap their crab-like forelimbs around the neck of the ants. And when an ant transfers energy to another ant in liquid form, these pop up their heads between the ants and slurp up some of the liquid honeydew which is being transferred between one ant and another. So this is a parasite you only find associated with these ants. This is the blind white woodlice, Platyarthros, and this is the beetle Claviger teftaceus on the left-hand side. Some people have suggested its antennae have got knobs like this so the ants can carry them about. This is the hoverfly Microton devius, quite unusual, 4 species of Microton in Britain, and they're all associated with these sorts of anthills, and their larvae are fed by the ants during the early stages before they pupate and then hatch out and mate and lay eggs inside the anthill again. Green woodpeckers, very important, and some people have associated the abundance of green woodpeckers in Britain with the abundance of anthills. And if you look at their holes, a series of holes in the diagram in the picture at the top, you can see a whole series of holes in the anthills created by green woodpeckers. We don't know whether the green woodpeckers go around ritually using the same holes time and time again in winter or not. But for 70 or 90% of the diet of green woodpeckers in winter are these ants, as you can tell from looking at an ant dropping, a green woodpecker dropping shown beneath. So, and there are also other small mammals, social bees, social wasps, solitary wasps, attacked by all sorts of other range of animals. We don't know quantitatively just how many, just how important they are for the maintenance of these mammals in a grassland, but it will be interesting to get some actual numbers on this, but they're certainly frequently attacked. So they're worth conserving. They're not likely to colonize new grasslands because the tramp black ant, Lasius niger, first colonizes new grasslands, and Lasius flavus, the yellow ant, takes over much later. They're characteristic of graze grasslands, and really you should mow, strim or scythe around anthills in gardens, roadside verges, churchyards or nature reserves if you've got the manpower, the person power. And this is necessary. In other words, set the mowing blades high. Try to maintain these anthills because they create extra microhabitats for species. And one site I visited recently was Brompton Cemetery. This shows the management plan for Brompton Cemetery. And there in autumn, in October, they had 6 people full-time out strimming the grave parts of the graveyard, particular blocks, where the anthills were maintained in their thousands in the cemetery. And this is something every churchyard really needs to preserve, strimming or scything if possible. So they're worth introducing to newly established grasslands which lack them. So if you're reconstituting grasslands, introduce anthills where they wouldn't otherwise colonize. And first of all, when people try to move these anthills from one place to another, they use wheelbarrows. But when we were at Richmond Park, Julia Balfour, who was head of ecology, and I arranged that we would move anthills which were threatened by some work on the Beverley Brook. And so what we did was to get a low loader in, which could pick up the whole anthill, plus, of course, the aphids associated with it in the surrounding grassland. and deposit it in a new site in the flying field about 1 kilometre away. So we made 5 holes in the recipient grassland with the same device and picked up 5 anthills which were threatened by the Beverley Brook and moved them 1 kilometre along the road and deposited them in this new site on the flying field where they currently thrive despite the dry weather. And that's something which could be done on a very large scale. Julia and I wrote a paper about it because when you want to move, say, 30 anthills at a time, as say for the Iron Bridge bypass, then this would be a very cost-effective way of doing it. It is much better than trying to pull everything up with a spade and a wheelbarrow. So anthills are worth preserving. So take-home messages. Large populations of large anthills indicate an old grassland which has accumulated lots of animal and plant species, many of which probably don't occur in the surrounding grassland. The mounds may last for hundreds of years. They have a major impact on species richness and patterns of plant and animal species. So you should introduce the yellow meadow ant to newly established grasslands which lack anthills. You should certainly put them in management plans. I'm continually reading management plans, especially for urban sites, which don't have anthills mentioned in them as a distinct habitat. This is a very old-fashioned attitude from the 1980s. We know much more about anthills now. Anthill index can be used to estimate grassland age, and anthill shapes and positions indicate their history. Fine, so that's the end for the time being. I'd be very happy to take any questions you have.
Thank you. That was absolutely fantastic, Tim. We've got loads of questions that have been coming through on the chat. I just thought it was amazing, to consider the massive ecological impact of anthills. I thought you brought that out really well. The range of different ways in which they contribute to, to the ecosystem, to modifying the environment, and obviously the importance of considering them in management plans. And I was particularly struck by that photograph, the Google photograph of Bushy Park, and just the sort of sea of anthills there, and thinking that there are 3 billion ant workers in Richmond Park. So this is on a huge scale. Really so interesting and so well presented. So thank you ever so much. We've got a lot of appreciation coming through in the chat. What I'm going to ask you to do now is, if you want to stop sharing your screen, and we'll go over to some of the questions from the chat. So then, yeah, that's perfect. Lovely. So are we okay, David, for you to start picking up some of the questions for us, please?
Yeah. There was a whole bunch of questions about whether grazing and whether mowing.
David, we can't hear you very well.
That might be better. There we go. Try again. There's a whole bunch of questions about grazing and mowing, all of which in the way of good talks you answered in the talk. But I'll pull out a couple. There was a question from Liz Anderson about if you've got a site where there's lots of anthills and it's very difficult to manage the grassland. Have you got any advice on what's a sort of cost-effective way to manage grassland when you've got lots of these big anthills on it?
No, not really. Most of the places where they've been maintained, take Brompton Cemetery, for example, are where there's enough money available in order to employ people to strim or scythe between the anthills. So the best advice I have, if you want to keep the grassland down, is if you can't afford to introduce cattle, sheep or deer, and some local farmers are prepared to lend their local stock because they actually get free grazing as a result, then you really need to introduce a scything regime, which probably means bringing in someone who is experienced at scything and giving people who haven't scythed before the experience of scything, many of which they enjoy, and also in churchyards in particular, scything is particularly important. The other thing that's happened you can do is to identify particular areas of these sites which are particularly valuable from the point of view of large anthills or anthills which contain particular groups of plant species you want to preserve. And if you have to mow the rest, in fact, over a certain size at Richmond Park, the people who work there have been told not to mow them, not to mow the site at all, just let them go and leave them to deer grazing. But there you do have grazing, whereas in many sites you don't.
Excellent. Let me have a look what else did people ask. There were loads of questions. Just staying on the sort of mowing and grazing and so on. If you were going to graze, what would be the best animals to use to graze to manage for ants?
Well, in London, it's rather difficult. But ideally, it should be sheep, because if you have a high density of sheep, of cattle, a high density of cattle can start destroying the mounds to some extent. But I like the idea of maintaining rabbit populations as well. In many places, rabbit populations have come back after myxomatosis, and they themselves automatically keep the vegetation level down on and around anthills. In fact, I didn't show the slide, but rabbits preferentially dung on the surface of anthills. That's most striking. And rabbits are really the best way of keeping them down if you have a site where they don't suffer much from myxomatosis. So I'd say rabbits first, then sheep, and then cattle. Goats are a bit too aggressive unless you've got places which have a lot of brambles or something, where they would get rid of the scrub as well.
Thank you. I'm going to go to Maria Fremlin now. You've got your hand up. Do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yeah, I'm unmuted. And this is a bit of question about the different habitat. We have these ants in our allotment site, and they colonize. I often find them attached to the roots of the dandelions, and so they farm them throughout the year. The question is, you said they bring aphids to their nest in the winter, and somebody was already asking that. How do they feed them? What are these aphids attached to?
Yes, there is a particular aphid species which lives on the roots of dandelion,
Yeah,
which they sometimes specialize in.
Yeah,
they pick up, there's good evidence, both from the field and from lab colonies, that they pick up these aphids at the start of winter, say late October, beginning of November in a typical year, and take them back to their mounds where they arrange them in lumps. And there they and the aphids hibernate because they're cold-blooded, that they would just, that's the reason why green woodpeckers can utilize them so easily. They're sitting targets. Below the surface in lumps, in their cavities inside the anthills. And so basically in a typical year before climate change, between the beginning of November and mid-March, these would just be lying there inert inside the anthills. And then once the ants wake up again, more recently I've noticed them waking up again sometimes in January. They will pick up the aphids and put them on the roots of the plants. Now, of course, the evidence for this in the field is slightly nebulous because, of course, you can't identify what the aphids are doing underneath the soil surface in a typical year. But to my mind, there are enough naturalist observations in the literature from 1950 backwards into the early 1800s to show that this is something that takes place.
well, with the dandelion root aphids, they stay on the root year round. I see them there, and sometimes the ants are present, sometimes they're not. In the winter, there are fewer ants around them, but the aphids, the dandelion root aphids, stay in the roots of the dandelions. In my plot, I find lots throughout in the winter.
Yeah, well, the life cycles of these aphids are very complicated. Some of them even have some of the large number, over 20 species associated with the ants, have alternate hosts in particular shrubs. So they spend some of the year in the shrubs, feeding on the leaves of the plant and stems of the plants, and then they only colonize the roots of the plants in the rest of the year. So it varies from one species to another.
Thank you ever so much. That was, again, a kind of, that's an interesting whole kind of talk in itself, I should think, aphids and their life cycles. David, can we go back to just pick up, I see there's so many questions coming through, but can we pick up another few from the chat? Yeah,
we're not going to get to all of them, but just for people trying to work out if they've got yellow meadow ants, are there other ants in UK that produce anthills, and how can you tell you've got a yellow meadow ant one?
The black ant, Lasius niger, the black garden ant, produces large anthills, sometimes in water meadows in particular. But these are pretty fragile and they're short-lived, and they are not frequently colonized by vegetation, although they may occur around the base of grass leaves and stems. And so this is the main ant hill producer in grasslands in Britain, and virtually all the anthills are produced by this particular species. Of course, in the grassland you can find a couple in particular of myrmica species, the red ants, and you can find the occasional other species, but they don't build mounds, and they're certainly long lasting like these particular mounds, which are quite distinctive. Of course, if you go into acid woodland and acid grassland in parts of European mountains, you can find species of formica, for example, which build large anthills, but they tend to be largely of things like pine needles rather than soil, and they're not colonized by typical grassland plants in the same way as Lasius flavus anthills are.
Thanks. So that would be helpful if you want to know what they've got. We had a question from JK about when the queens are forming new colonies. Do they need bare soil to start their colony, or can they dig in anywhere?
Yes, they need bare soil. That's well known, and so existing anthills, especially those which have lost their previous queen, are ripe for colonization. The people have done experiments on this which suggest that the most efficient way of colony foundation is for 2, 3, 4, or up to 20 queens to colonize the same patch of bare soil simultaneously. And then it's more likely that at least one of them will survive for a long time in order to establish the colony. And sometimes there might be 2 or 3 starting a colony. In various studies, the average number of queens per colony is 1.5, but ultimately one may eliminate the others. There's also the possibility, which is, I think, rather less evidence for that, is that if a queen dies, sometimes an existing worker can become fertile and start producing eggs itself. But that's, for this species, the evidence for that is not very good.
Okay, thank you. Couple more general questions. So Anthony Mills asked, do they do well in dense clay soils as well as the more loose and sandy ones?
Yes, they do. For example, if you take the Old Hall marshes, which are in Kent, are they? The anthills occur between the tide marks, so they can put up with some in a salt marsh, they can put up with the salty soil and the clay, and they can put up with submersion for a few hours each day before the sea retreats again. And they also occur a lot in marshes. There are several papers from China mentioning their occurrence in marsh situations in China. So they do occur in clay as well as sandy soils and chalk grassland in particular.
Excellent. And actually, the picture behind me is a clay-based site where you can probably just see some yellow ant-hills right at the bottom there, behind my shoulder. Anyway, let's see what else have we got. Yeah, there's a question from Mike Edwards. When you gave some statistics on the size of the anthills and their volume and so on. How do you go about measuring the volume of an anthill?
Well, I've actually put something on the back of my talk about this, although it's a bit risky to try to find it. Can you see the front page of my talk there? If I try to get down to the end of the talk,
you have to share your screen again, I think.
Screen again, then we could see that.
Are you in? Is enough people interested in that to find out?
Yeah, let's go for it.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, let's go for that. That'd be a nice way to finish off.
I'll have a go at finding the particular. I've got that now. How do I share my screen?
So you should still have your little green share screen icon.
Oh dear, I don't have. I've got the right page now.
We could always send the page round to people after the talk, if that would be easier.
If I can get hold of it. I'm afraid I can't get hold of it, but basically the simple way to do it, you can get an awful lot of information from the technique is as follows. You take a 10 by 10 meter patch of anthills and you measure the size of every single anthill on it. On each anthill, you measure its height, north, east, south, and west, 4 measurements, and you measure its diameter, north to south and east to west. And you accumulate all the data. From that, by thinking of an anthill as a segment of a sphere, you can work out its volume. You can also work out all sorts of other statistics about the anthills, like their surface area and so on. And so you can get an awful lot of statistics by sampling a population of anthills in that way.
Excellent. I probably only got time for one more. So there's quite a nice question here from let me see if I can read the name, Mies Bajiwaji, who asked, is there anything you can do to encourage ants to form these anthills, to help with recovery if you've got a site where they've been damaged or they're not there? So any general advice for people? How can they help?
I found that the colonization, natural colonization of a new site depends on partly whether there are sites nearby. So if there are sites nearby, new sites tend to be rapidly colonized by the large numbers of queens, fertilized queens, which are produced from an existing colony in late summer and autumn. And then the best way is to create some areas of bare soil. I mean, obviously, the best way of all is to do what Julia and I did, which is to pick up some anthills in a wheelbarrow or on a low loader and transport them into the new site. Because then you get, if the mound is quite large already and producing drones and queens, then you get their nuptial flight taking place from the very start, and the new fertilized queens can colonize the rest of the site. But basically you need bare soil, some bare soil on the site for the new ants, queens to colonize. And one way in which that happens is, for example, if you've got a rabbit population on the site, they will create their own patches of bare soil. If there are badgers there already, they will have their own patches of bare soil, and so on. Or even grazing animals will create, like sheep or cattle will create some bare soil. If not, you can create it yourself. But it's a bit difficult and nebulous to actually pick up the fertilized queens yourself and introduce them into the soil. Most of that will happen naturally because, as I said, in a abundant site, a single anthill might produce 200 queens a year. Or John Pontin found up to 400 queens on a single anthill. So if you've got a population of 100 anthills, they will produce 400 times that number of queens a year, and those spread out over a wide area, and so they will colonize. So in London, what would happen is that there are sites in graveyards and in public parks which are sources of anthills all the time, and because of the connectivity between habitats, they're even spread out from places like Brompton Cemetery over the surrounding grasslands and gardens, and which will always be colonized to some extent, providing there's bare soil there.
Thank you so much, and that's a sort of nice optimistic end that there, it is possible for areas to be recolonized. There's a big pool of queens that we can that are moving around and that can be drawn upon. So thank you so much. I'm afraid we are going to have to draw to a close there. There are a lot of questions that we didn't manage to answer, but Dr. Tim King has very kindly said we can circulate his email details. So if you're happy with that, Tim, we'll send an email, a message around to everybody, so that if you want to correspond directly and you can ask a question if we didn't get around to it. I'm very grateful that you've offered to do that. So are you happy that we go ahead with that plan?
Yes, I'm very happy with that.
So that was just such a fantastic talk. There are so many really enthusiastic messages in the chat. You probably can't kind of see because you're concentrating on giving the talk, but people saying fantastic talk, brilliant, so clearly explained, full of information. Really, it's been such a, and somebody said, worthwhile way to spend your evening. So we're very, very grateful that you agreed to come and do the talk for us, and we'll certainly be circulating around. I know there's Tony Madgwick has been talking about interest in bees and wasps using ant nests. So do kind of contact him as well if you've got any evidence of that. Thank you ever so much, everybody, for coming. Just to let you know that the next event, we've got 2 more events coming in January. The next event is on the 20th of January, which will be the next Brad Ashby Memorial Lecture, which we referred to briefly in the introduction today. So this year will be one from Paul Richards. It's going to be about harvestmen, and it's called I Am Not a Spider. So that should be really fantastic, and that's in a couple of weeks' time. And then on the 27th, we've got our best botanical photos of 2021, when some members of the society show some of their best botanical photos that were taken last year. So 2 really nice events to look forward to. I just want to say, one last time, thank you. We're so grateful for your talk this evening, Tim, and it was really well enjoyed by so many people. We had an excellent attendance, over 250 people. So that's been a really fantastic evening. Thank you again.
Thank you very much.
If people want to say goodbye.
Thank you very